Most people who know the story of the burning bush can picture the moment easily. God speaks. Moses hides his face. And somewhere in there, God tells him to take off his sandals, a detail most of us have filed away under one simple category: reverence. You take off your shoes because you're standing somewhere holy, the same instinct that makes people slip off their shoes at the door of someone's home. It's a tidy, satisfying explanation, and it isn't wrong, exactly. But step into the world Moses actually lived in, and a more specific layer starts to surface. In the ancient Near East, feet and footwear weren't only about cleanliness or courtesy. They were tied to something with real legal weight, the language of land, ownership, and claims, documented not only in Scripture, but in legal texts from surrounding cultures entirely outside the Bible. Which raises a question worth sitting with. If removing a sandal, in Moses's world, could mean something as specific and consequential as giving up a claim to land, what was God actually asking Moses to relinquish on that mountain? And does reverence alone fully capture it? The answer sits inside a strange little custom, easy to overlook, tucked away in a much later, much smaller book of the Bible, one that finally explains, in plain terms, exactly what this gesture meant to the very first people who performed it. But before we get to that later book, we need to understand exactly who Moses was and what kind of relationship to land he actually had by the time he reached that mountain. By this point in his life, Moses has already lost two homes. He was born into slavery in Egypt, saved from Pharaoh's death order as an infant, and raised inside Pharaoh's own household, a strange, borrowed belonging to a nation that wasn't really his, in a palace that was never truly home. Then, as a grown man, after killing an Egyptian overseer he saw beating a Hebrew slave, Moses fled into the wilderness, and that borrowed Egyptian identity collapsed too. Exodus tells us he settled in Midian, married Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest named Jethro, and spent decades tending his father-in-law's flock, an occupation that itself carried no land of its own, no fixed address, only wherever the animals needed to graze next. He names his son Gershom, saying, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land," a small detail that tells us exactly how Moses understood his own situation. Not a landowner, not a citizen, a guest, twice over, in two different countries that were never fully his. This matters because it's this landless shepherd, decades into an ordinary, forgotten life, no longer young, no longer positioned for anything resembling greatness by any normal measure, who leads Jethro's flock to the west side of the wilderness and comes to Horeb, called in the text the mountain of God. Not his mountain, not his people's mountain yet either. This happens generations before Israel's own claim to any promised territory, just an unclaimed, unowned stretch of wilderness, the kind of place nobody in this story has any legal right to. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the people Moses was born to are living under conditions that have grown steadily worse. Egypt, in this period, is a powerful, settled empire, its pharaohs ruling over an enormous, highly organized labor economy, and Israel exists inside it as an enslaved underclass, forced into increasingly harsh labor. Egyptian building projects in this general era relied heavily on forced and conscripted labor, brickmaking, construction, and agricultural work among them, and Exodus describes exactly this kind of labor being imposed on the Israelites, with taskmasters increasing the burden further when Moses first appeals to Pharaoh. Exodus 2 tells us their groaning rose up to God, and that God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, a covenant that included, from its very beginning, centuries earlier, a specific promise of land. Land Abraham himself had walked through as a landless sojourner, never fully possessing it in his own lifetime, and land his descendants, now generations later, are enslaved far away from entirely. So when Moses looks up and sees a bush burning without being consumed, flames climbing over branches that never blacken, never curl, never fall to ash, everything about the scene sits inside this same theme, quietly, before a single word is spoken. A landless shepherd, a borrowed mountain. A people enslaved far from a promised territory, their ancestor never fully possessed either. And it's into this exact moment, before Moses has taken a single additional step toward the fire, that the voice from within the bush speaks, and gives him, before anything else, an instruction about his feet. Look at the actual order of what happens in this scene. Exodus 3:4-5. God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses," and he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." Notice what hasn't happened yet at this point in the conversation. Moses has been called by name twice in a way that would have startled anyone standing alone in an empty wilderness. He's answered. And then, before a single word about who is speaking, before any mention of Egypt, Pharaoh, or the covenant with Abraham, comes this instruction about his feet. It's easy to read past the sequence here because we already know how the story ends. We know it's God speaking, so we naturally read the sandal command as something God asks after establishing who he is. But that's not the order the text actually gives us. The self-identification, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob," comes in the very next verse, after the sandal command, not before it. Think of a stranger's voice, calling your name, from a place you can't fully explain or verify, telling you to set something down before telling you who they are or why you should trust them at all. That's closer to the actual shape of this encounter than the more familiar, softened picture of a fully revealed God gently asking a devoted follower for a small, comfortable gesture of respect. Which means, whatever this command was actually asking of Moses, it wasn't something he was in a position to weigh against a clear picture of who was asking, or why. Not a request made after trust was established, the way a friend might ask a favor once a relationship has already proven itself reliable. A request made in the middle of uncertainty, before Moses had anything solid to base his obedience on beyond the voice itself. But if Moses didn't yet know who was speaking, we still need to understand what a command like this would have actually meant to him, specifically sandals, specifically feet. And that requires stepping outside the book of Exodus entirely, into the wider world Moses' culture actually operated in. Here's where the picture widens considerably. In the ancient Near East, the region and cultural sphere Moses' world belonged to, feet and footwear carried a specific kind of legal significance that most modern readers have no natural reason to know about. Archaeological evidence from Nuzi, a Hurrian city whose surviving legal archive dates to the 2nd millennium BC, roughly the general era of Israel's own patriarchal and early history, documents a striking custom tied to land transactions. When property changed hands, the transfer was symbolically confirmed through an action involving the feet, the previous owner lifting his foot off the land, and the new owner or heir stamping his foot down onto it, physically asserting the claim. Legal tablets from this archive describe the ritual in exactly these terms, as part of the formal, recorded procedure for finalizing a transfer of fields or houses between parties. This isn't a stray detail from a single obscure text. It reflects a broader pattern, documented across multiple Hittite-influenced legal texts from this general period and region, of feet functioning as a physical symbol of ownership and claim. Picture a modern deed signing, but instead of ink on paper and a notarized signature, the transaction is sealed by an actual physical gesture involving the ground itself, someone stepping off a property they're relinquishing, someone else stepping onto it to claim it in front of witnesses. The land, in this world, wasn't just a paper transaction filed away somewhere. It was something your body engaged with directly, and the position of your feet mattered legally, not just practically. Which means that in the world Moses actually lived in, an instruction involving footwear and ground wasn't automatically, or only, about courtesy or basic manners toward a host. It belonged to a recognizable category of gesture already carrying legal weight, the language of claims, ownership, and relinquishment, expressed through the body's direct contact with the earth itself. But the ancient Near Eastern evidence, on its own, only tells us what surrounding cultures did. To understand what this specific gesture, removing a sandal, meant inside Israel's own community, we need a text that explains it directly, in Israel's own words. Move forward, centuries later in Israel's own history, to a much smaller, quieter story, the Book of Ruth. Boaz, negotiating the right to redeem a piece of land and marry Ruth, deals with a closer relative who holds first legal right to that redemption but ultimately declines it, and the text pauses its own narrative to explain something to its readers directly, as though anticipating that even its original audience might need the custom spelled out. Ruth 4:7 reads, "Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. The unnamed relative removes his sandal and hands it to Boaz, in full view of the town elders gathered at the gate, formally relinquishing his right to redeem the land." Notice how directly this text explains itself. Scripture rarely stops to define its own customs this plainly. Most cultural practices in the Bible are simply performed, left for readers to understand from context, assumed knowledge shared between the original author and audience. But here, the narrator interrupts the story specifically to make sure the custom is understood. Sandal removal, handed to another party, confirmed a legal transaction. Specifically, in this case, a transaction about land. This is worth sitting with, because it's not a scholarly reconstruction pieced together from outside sources. It's Scripture's own explanation, in Scripture's own words, of what sandal removal meant within Israel's own legal culture, relinquishing a claim, formally, physically, in front of witnesses. There's a related custom worth mentioning briefly, from Deuteronomy 25, that reinforces this same association without needing to carry the main weight of the argument. If a man refused his duty to marry his deceased brother's widow, preserving his brother's name and inheritance, the widow was instructed to remove his sandal in a public ceremony as a formal mark of his refusal. Different circumstance, same underlying grammar, the sandal removed, publicly, in front of the elders of the town, marking the relinquishment or refusal of a claim tied to land and family inheritance. Not identical to Exodus 3, but part of the same recognizable pattern running through Israel's legal customs, appearing again and again across very different books and very different centuries. Which means we now have two converging lines of evidence pointing toward the same conclusion. The wider ancient Near Eastern custom of feet, symbolizing land claims, and Israel's own explicitly stated legal custom of sandal removal confirming relinquishment. Not a coincidental overlap. A consistent cultural grammar in which what happened at the feet meant something specific about what a person was, or wasn't, claiming. Which brings us back to Horeb, to a landless shepherd standing before a bush that burns without being consumed, hearing an instruction that would have meant something very particular to him, long before he understood who was asking him to obey it. There's one more piece of evidence worth adding here, from much later in Israel's story, that quietly reinforces this same pattern. Exodus 28 and 29, along with Exodus 39, describe the garments Israel's priests were to wear while serving in the tabernacle, in extraordinary detail: the woven tunic, the sash, the turban, the ephod, the breastplate set with stones, even the undergarments. Almost every part of the priest's body is accounted for, deliberately, specifically, garment by garment. Footwear is never mentioned. Not once, across multiple chapters devoted to describing exactly what a priest was supposed to wear while standing in God's presence. Some scholars, including Menahem Haran in his work on Israel's temple service, have noted this silence and connected it to a broader detail worth remembering. The Levites, the priestly tribe, were explicitly given no tribal allotment of land in Israel, unlike every other tribe descended from Jacob's sons. Numbers 18:20 states this directly. God tells Aaron, "You shall have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel." While Scripture doesn't explicitly state the reason footwear is absent from the priestly garment lists, the pattern is difficult to ignore once it's been named. Those who served closest to God's presence were also, specifically, the one tribe with no independent claim to territory of their own. This connection should be held as a scholarly observation rather than an explicit textual claim. The text never says, "Therefore priests went barefoot," but the pattern it points toward fits remarkably well with everything already surfacing at the bush and at Jericho. Which means the landless shepherd at Horeb, standing barefoot before holy ground, wasn't simply a one-time image. It's the seed of a pattern that would eventually shape an entire tribe's relationship to land and to service in Israel's worship, generations later. If you've never connected Ruth's quiet legal footnote to Moses's bare feet on a mountain before, that's exactly the kind of layer this channel exists to uncover. Subscribe to the Scripture Project if studies like this are what you come here for, because there's still a detail worth chasing further. This isn't the only place in Scripture where God gives this exact command. Centuries after Moses, standing before a very different landscape, another man hears almost the identical words, at a moment that looks, on the surface, nothing like a burning bush in the wilderness. If the same command shows up twice, spoken to two very different men, in two very different situations, that repetition isn't likely to be accidental, and it raises a real question about what these two moments actually share. Move forward, decades after the wilderness wandering finally ends, to the edge of the Jordan River, just before Israel crosses into Canaan. Joshua, Moses' successor, is standing near Jericho, about to lead the conquest of the land God promised centuries earlier to Abraham, a city with walls that had, by this point in the narrative, already become the central obstacle standing between Israel and the fulfillment of that ancient promise. And Joshua encounters a figure the text calls the commander of the army of the Lord, standing with a drawn sword. Joshua's response is immediate. He falls face down and asks, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the answer he receives is almost word for word what Moses heard generations earlier. "Take off your sandal from your foot, for the place where you are standing is holy." Joshua 5:15. Not a similar instruction, loosely echoing an old story. Nearly identical language, describing the same physical action, tied to the same stated reason. Now hold that detail next to the very different circumstances surrounding it. Moses receives this command decades earlier, in the middle of an unclaimed wilderness, at the very beginning of a story about deliverance from slavery, a moment of calling, before anything has happened yet. Joshua receives it standing at the edge of the actual promised land, on the eve of conquest, at what looks, on the surface, like the ending of the same long story Moses' calling had started. Put these two moments side by side, and the deliberateness of the echo becomes hard to dismiss as coincidence. This is 911, L.A., Darden, two different men, two dramatically different moments in Israel's story, one at the very start of the Exodus, one at what should be its triumphant conclusion, and yet the same command, the same specific gesture, the same stated reason, holy ground. This is worth sitting with, because it would have been easy for the author of Joshua to describe this encounter differently, a different gesture, a different form of reverence, a general passing note that Joshua simply bowed low before a powerful figure. Instead, the text reaches for language close enough to Exodus 3 that any reader familiar with Moses' story would recognize it almost instantly, word for word. Many scholars regard this near-verbal repetition as a deliberate literary echo, and the parallel is strong enough and precise enough that it's reasonable to read it as intentional rather than accidental, though, as with any claim about an ancient author's specific intent, this remains an interpretive judgment rather than something the text states about itself directly. And what that repetition reveals is something the surface details of these two scenes might otherwise obscure. Even standing at the literal edge of the Promised Land, moments before the land finally, actually becomes Israel's, Joshua is told the exact same thing Moses was told before anything had been given yet. Take off your sandal, this ground is not yours to claim. Not Moses's wilderness alone, not merely the starting point of the story. The very edge of the promise's fulfillment carries the identical instruction, relinquish your claim, even here, especially here, which reframes what the sandal command was actually revealing about the whole shape of Israel's story, from Horeb to Jericho. This was never a gesture reserved for the beginning of the journey, something you performed once, at the calling, and then set aside as the promise came into view. It's spoken again, deliberately, right at the threshold of the land's actual conquest, as if Scripture itself wanted to make sure no reader concluded that arriving at the promise ever changed who the ground ultimately belonged to. Moses relinquished a claim to unclaimed wilderness before he knew what he was being called to. Joshua relinquished a claim to the literal promised land, standing right on top of it, on the very edge of finally possessing what generations had waited for. Same command, same posture. The land was never actually the point where Israel's ownership began, because, in the deepest sense, the text keeps insisting on, it never fully was Israel's to own at all. It belonged, first and always, to the one who had simply agreed to let them live on it. A shepherd, a borrowed flock, a mountain that wasn't his. Twice already, Moses had lost a home, Egypt first, then the life he tried to build after it. A sojourner, he called himself, a stranger in every land he'd ever stood on. And then, a bush, burning, not consumed, his name called twice. Here I am, he answers. And before anything else, before Egypt, before Pharaoh, before the covenant, before even a name for the voice speaking to him, one instruction: take off your sandals. Not after trust, not after understanding, before either. In Moses's world, that gesture wasn't only about manners. Feet on land sealed claims. Lifted off, a right surrendered. Pressed down, a right declared. Documented, outside Scripture entirely, in the legal memory of the ancient world Moses belonged to. Tablets from a city called Nuzi, describing the same custom in almost clinical legal terms, generations before Moses himself was born. And inside Scripture, a small book, generations later, spelling it out plainly. A sandal, removed, handed over. A transaction, sealed. Ruth 4:7. Israel's own explanation, in Israel's own words. Relinquish, not merely respect. A widow, generations later still, removing another man's sandal in front of witnesses, marking a refused inheritance. A priest, robed head to toe in painstaking detail, tunic and sash and turban and breastplate, and no mention, anywhere, of what covered his feet. A tribe with no land of its own at all. The pattern, quietly repeating, long before anyone called it a pattern. Which is what makes the second great scene, the one at Jericho, impossible to read as coincidence. Decades later, a different man, a different edge of the story. Joshua, standing not in an unclaimed wilderness, but at the very threshold of the promised land itself, sword drawn before him, and the same words, almost exactly. Take off your sandal, this ground is holy. Not the beginning of the story this time, the edge of its fulfillment, and still the same command, which means the sandal was never only about a shepherd's calling, back at the start of everything, before there was anything yet to claim. It was about the whole story. Even standing on the actual land, promised for generations, finally within reach, still not yours to plant your feet on as though it belonged to you first. Relinquished at the beginning, relinquished again at the very edge of arrival. The ground changes, the command doesn't. Most of us build our sense of security around ground we can point to. A career we've spent years shaping, a relationship we've invested everything in, a plan for how the next decade is supposed to go, carefully paced out, carefully earned. It isn't wrong to build these things. It's simply what people do, the way Moses built a quiet life in Midian after everything else had already been taken from him. There's a specific vulnerability in that kind of building, though, worth naming honestly. The more carefully something is built, the more it can start to feel like proof of something. Proof that you finally arrived somewhere solid. Proof that this ground, at least, is yours to stand on without question. It's a natural instinct. It's also, if this story is telling the truth about how God tends to work, not a safe assumption to build an entire identity around. And most of us, if we're honest, would rather be asked to give something up after we understand why, after the reasons make sense, after we've had time to weigh the cost against a clear picture of who's asking and what it's for. That isn't how it happened at the bush. Moses is asked to relinquish something before he's told anything at all. No explanation of Egypt yet, no mention of Pharaoh or the plagues or the sea about to split in two. Just a voice, calling his name, and an instruction about his feet, arriving before a single reason has been given for trusting it. There's a particular kind of fear that lives inside that gap, the space between being asked to let go of something and actually understanding why. Most of us know that fear, the diagnosis that arrives before the treatment plan, the door that closes before the next one opens, the relationship that ends before you can see what's supposed to come after it. Loss, arriving first. Understanding, if it comes at all, arriving much later, sometimes not arriving in any complete way in this life at all. It's an uncomfortable thing to sit with, the idea that clarity might not be owed to us before obedience is asked for, but it's difficult to read Exodus 3 honestly and land anywhere else. Moses wasn't asked to give up his sandals because he'd already been shown the burning bush would lead to a nation crossing dry ground through a parted sea. He didn't know any of that yet. He was asked to give it up standing in the dark, with nothing but a voice and a fire that didn't behave the way fire should. And Joshua, decades later, standing on ground his whole life and the whole life of the generation before him had been aimed toward, receives the same instruction. At the very moment it would have made the most sense to finally feel like the ground belonged to him. Arrival didn't cancel the command. It simply repeated it, unchanged, as though the years of wandering in between had settled nothing about who the ground ultimately answered to. Maybe that's the part of this story that reaches furthest into an ordinary life. Not a single, dramatic moment of relinquishment, completed once and never revisited. A pattern, asked for before understanding arrives, asked for again, even after the promise seems to have finally been reached, not because God enjoys watching people hold nothing, but because the ground, in every version of this story, was never actually the thing being offered. What was being offered was a relationship with the one who owned it all along, and that relationship, apparently, was never going to be built on Moses or Joshua or anyone else, keeping something back to stand on, just in case. There's a quiet comfort tucked inside this pattern too, worth naming before the study closes. If relinquishment were only demanded once, at some beginning most of us have already passed, it might feel like a test we'd either already failed or already passed for good. But a repeated pattern, asked for again at the threshold of arrival, suggests something gentler underneath the difficulty. That God isn't looking for people who have already learned to hold nothing perfectly. He's looking for people willing to keep opening their hands, again, at each new threshold, the way Moses did in the wilderness, and Joshua did at the edge of Jericho, neither of them having fully mastered the posture before being asked to take it again. Maybe that's worth carrying away from a mountain in the wilderness and a riverbank near Jericho, two moments separated by decades and by everything that happened in between them, joined by nothing more than a single, quiet, repeated instruction about a person's feet. The ground was never really the subject. The willingness to stand on it empty-handed was. The sandals came off before the answers did. Some ground is only ever holy once you're willing to stand on it with nothing in your hands and nothing under your feet but trust. If this is the first time you've heard that command the way its first hearers did, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to the Scripture Project so studies like this keep finding you. Share it with someone still waiting for the reasons before they're willing to let go. And if a line here stayed with you, leave it in the comments. This is a community built on one honest conversation at a time.